I can't think of a brand that makes choosing between a car and a crossover more difficult than Mazda. Granted, I'm sure a lot of you out there have a good sense of what you want before you even start the shopping process, but even then, there's no easy choice. So before you set your sights on the CX-5, make sure to take a look across the showroom at the Mazda 6. Don't get me wrong, the CX-5 is a great crossover to drive. It's got to be the most car-like crossover of its kind on the market right now, and it has some great driving dynamics and excellent engine options. But objectively speaking, the Mazda 6 is just better, and that really shouldn't surprise anyone out there. It's lower, leaner, and generally speaking, it's just a lot more satisfying behind the wheel, especially in a turbo model like this one. Now, it's the same engine you can get in just about every other Mazda model. It's a 2.5-liter four-cylinder, and it makes 250 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque. And that is a lot no matter how you look at it, especially all that torque. It's more than you get in something like the Subaru WRX STI or even the Honda Civic Type R. It's the stuff that helps when you're accelerating, and this has to be the best application of this engine out there right now. Since I just reviewed the CX-9 and you watched that video and subscribed to Autotrader.ca, it seems like a pretty good place to start. And when you look at that thing, it's just a little too big and bulky for this engine. But then if you look at something smaller like the CX-30 or the Mazda 3, it feels pretty peaky, but here it is perfect. Nice and smooth linear acceleration, but it's also ready to give you a kick in the pants when you ask for it. Now, purists, plug your ears, but you know what this reminds me of a little bit? That old Legacy GT that Subaru built about 15 years ago. And no, I'm not talking about the Spec B version, but then again, it doesn't feel that far off either. No, you can't get this with a manual transmission, and yes, it's only offered with front-wheel drive, but it has the same sort of smooth, composed performance of that thing. It also has a really nice rumble from under the hood when you get on that accelerator pedal. I really like the way this turbo motor sounds. It's a pretty straightforward setup in here. You get a 6-speed automatic transmission, paddle shifters on the steering wheel, and a sport mode that you engage down here on the console. And all that does is sharpen up throttle response. It doesn't do anything to change the suspension or steering, but that's because it doesn't need to. Remember, this isn't a sports sedan and it's not pretending to be one. So rather than dial in some artificial steering, Mazda gives you a pretty good setup right out of the gate. No, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's got a ton of feel to it, but it's nice and responsive and it gives you confidence behind the wheel. And that to me is way more important than any fake steering feel. I do wish the suspension did just a little bit of a better job soaking up rough stuff, but again, I think it's smooth enough that it's going to keep most people happy. Now, if you want a sedan like this with a little more duality to it, there's always the Honda Accord with the 2-liter engine under the hood that you can get with adjustable dampers. But if you want something that's just a little bit more laid back but usable in every situation, this Mazda 6 is about as good as it's gonna get. And this cabin is way nicer than the one you get in that Accord. I really do like that car, but my biggest knock against it is that the cabin is just so boring, but this thing blows it out of the water with this red leather upholstery. And you know, this stuff really does hide what's a pretty understated cabin overall, but it's not bad for the segment and it's pretty par for the course, but this really takes it up a notch. I love the look of this. This is the Curo edition, so it's one step from the very top, but I'd say it's well worth it for the look of this cabin alone. Now, speaking of the cabin, there's not a ton of space in here, so if you need extra room, a crossover like the CX-5 is going to be the more obvious choice. But by midsize sedan standards, it's not too bad, though I do wish there was more headroom up here in the front half of the cabin. As you can see, I'm pretty cramped and I'm slouching kind of naturally because I can sense that my head is really close to this headliner. And if you look at me when I'm sitting up straight, my head is just bashing into the edge of this sunroof. It is very uncomfortable, and then it has a ripple effect. I have to keep my seat further back so that my head isn't cutting into this corner, but that also puts me further away from the steering wheel, which doesn't telescope far enough for me to be comfortable driving. And then the other problem is, well, that cuts into rear seat legroom as well. I can sit behind myself, though not quite as comfortably as I can in the Subaru Legacy. But you know, it's not all doom and gloom in here, and if you're shorter than me and you don't want the bulky back end of a crossover following you around everywhere you go, this isn't a bad option. Though I do have to point out my problem with the trunk. If you take a look at it on paper, it's about the same as the Legacy and the Accord, but the opening is very narrow. It's the way the hinges swing down that makes it a problem. I can't even fit Patty, our cargo testing pedal car, in the back of this thing, and that is a big problem. As a point of reference, if you take a look at the Toyota Corolla or the Nissan Sentra, I'm able to get that thing in both of those, and they are much smaller than this Mazda 6. So that is something worth pointing out, though it is a nice and deep space, so you can fit suitcases or golf bags in there without a problem. Now some stuff I haven't talked about yet, features and tech. You get this 8-inch infotainment display, and that is standard in every version of the Mazda 6. It's also a touchscreen, but because Mazda doesn't like you using touchscreens when you're driving, you also get this controller down here on the console. And it's not too bad to use, though I am of the mindset that it's not any less distracting than just tapping the touchscreen anyways. And I did see some comments, especially on my Mazda CX-30 video, that I didn't know what I was talking about when it came to this console controller and that it's easy to get used to. That is very true, and I'm not taking anything away from Mazda's approach to safety, though I will point out not all features work with this thing. Let's say you want to zoom out on Google Maps. Well, you have to move this thing around until you highlight that little icon on the map and then tap it to actually minimize. Why can't I just pinch and swipe? And the other thing is, even when you're stopped, you can't swipe on Google Maps. I know that might seem like a small bone to pick with this thing, but it's very frustrating, especially if you're in an area that you're not familiar with and you're trying to get around. Those are the kind of things that I get really frustrated with and I can't imagine living with every day. Now, the other thing is, I already said it's got Google Maps, and that's because it gets both Android Auto and Apple CarPlay standard. And the top 3 trims, well, they get wireless Apple CarPlay, though it's kind of a moot point because there's no wireless phone charger. You got to have your phone plugged in to charge it up anyways, because it'll drain your battery pretty quick, especially if you're on a longer trip. That's a little bit of a weird thing for me, especially because just about every other entry in this segment has a wireless charger these days. Now, like I said earlier, this one I'm driving is the Kuro Edition, so it's one from the top. It's actually based on the GT trim, but it comes with all kinds of extra goodies, like that turbo engine or this red leather upholstery, as well as a bunch of unique exterior and interior accents that are special to this model. You also get stuff like heated and ventilated front seats, a heated steering wheel, heated rear seats, a head-up display, and an 11-speaker stereo system. And then there's a well-rounded advanced safety package. You get stuff like adaptive cruise control that works in stop-and-go traffic, blind spot monitoring, lane keep assist, and forward automatic emergency braking with pedestrian detection. But unfortunately, not all of that stuff is standard in the Mazda 6. You've got to step up to the GSL trim to get most of it. If you get the base one, all you get is forward automatic emergency braking and blind spot monitoring. And if you take a look at competitors like Subaru, Honda, or Toyota, they're including all of that stuff in every version of their mid-size sedans. So that is something worth keeping in mind if you're shopping for a car like this. You're going to have to spend just a little bit more money to get those desirable features. And if you take a look at that base trim, well, it starts at $29.5 grand before tax. If you step up to that GSL, that's $33.5 grand, and then for about $37 grand, you get the GT trim. Then there's this one for about 40 grand, or the fully loaded signature model that really makes this feel a lot more upscale with stuff like Nappa leather and genuine wood trim inside. And that's right around 42 grand before taxes. To recap, I like the way the Mazda 6 drives, the red leather in this Kuro Edition, and the turbo engine. I don't like the awkward cabin space, the small trunk opening, or the lack of a wireless phone charger. I know the lack of all-wheel drive is going to be a deal breaker for some of you, but there are only a couple sedans like that out there, and I don't really think it's necessary anyway. And besides, since this thing isn't all-wheel drive, it's better on gas than a comparable CX-5, not to mention just a little more engaging. And speaking of the CX-5, there is a Kuro edition of that thing too, but it only comes with the smaller engine. To get the CX-5 GT with this big motor is going to cost you a couple grand more, though that doesn't really make the decision any easier. At the end of the day, I do think it's going to come down to preference over anything else, but I will say this. If you don't need all the space of a crossover like that and you want something with just a little more character, it's hard to go wrong with this midsize sedan.